The colony world of Vera 9 burned beneath alien rule. What had once been a thriving human settlement, filled with glittering towers and bustling trade ports, had been reduced to a battlefield. The Draelith, a species known across the spiral arms as conquerors without equal, had arrived with their massive fleets. Their ships were unlike anything humanity had ever built. Smooth, organic curves plated with shimmering alloys, and their weapons were engines of annihilation. Where they struck, nothing survived. For years, humans had whispered about the Draelith. Stories of their warriors wrapped in living armor, impervious to rifles and artillery alike, had spread across colonies like ghost tales. When the invasion began, those whispers became reality. Plasma rounds melted harmlessly against their defenses, rockets detonated in vain, and even orbital cannons failed to pierce their black, pulsating armor. Against such force, human defenses collapsed. Cities crumbled and soldiers fought with desperation, not expectation. On this night, the war reached its lowest point. The sky above Vera 9 was filled with fire, broken ships, falling debris, explosions that turned night into false daylight. Thousands fled the capital, streams of survivors pushing through collapsing streets, searching for shelter where none remained. Yet in the midst of chaos, amid the wreckage and screams, one figure stood still. Commander Elias Kane had no army left. His squad, men and women he had led for years, were gone, slain, scattered, or burned away by the Draelith war machines. His armor was cracked, its systems failing, and his lungs burned with smoke. By all rights, he should have joined the retreat, but something inside him refused to bow. He carried in his grip a stolen prize, a Draelith plasma-edged blade wrenched from the dead hand of one of their champions. It was heavier than anything forged on Earth, humming faintly with alien energy, and it had become the only weapon he could trust. The enemy descended again. From the flames strode the Draelith Queen Commander, her presence announced by the hiss of scorched air. She was colossal, towering over human soldiers, her crimson armor laced with energy veins that pulsed like blood. Her reputation preceded her. Whole fleets had knelt under her command. To Elias, she looked less like a general and more like a god of war made flesh. Her voice boomed across the battlefield, translated through vibrating speakers embedded in her armor. She mocked him, mocked humanity, mocked the very idea that a fragile species of flesh and bone could resist her people's destiny. "You are broken," she declared. "Your kind kneels when faced with strength. Why do you still resist?" The truth was, Elias had no reason left to fight, no tactical advantage, no reinforcements, no hope. But in that moment, standing in the ruins of his world, he understood something deeper. Surrender was worse than death. To give in was to erase everything his people had ever stood for. His voice came hoarse but steady. "Because I'm human, and we don't kneel." That defiance enraged her. The ground quaked as she lunged, her massive war blade cutting the air like lightning. To face her should have been suicide. Her armor had never been pierced. Her enemies had never left her standing. But Elias didn't think, didn't plan. He simply acted, every muscle and nerve driven by raw instinct and fury. He raised the stolen blade, swung with all the force left in his broken body, and struck. The air cracked with heat as alien metal met alien alloy. Sparks erupted, the sound echoing louder than the war around them. And then the unthinkable happened. The Queen stumbled backward. A gash split across her chest plate. For the first time in her endless campaigns, her armor failed. Beneath the shattered piece of crimson plating, dark blood welled up, spilling into the light. Silence rippled outward. Draelith warriors froze, stunned that their invincible commander had been wounded. Human survivors, scattered across the ruins, saw it too. Something impossible had just occurred. For the Queen, the wound was shallow, but the damage was far greater than physical. It was psychological. She, who had been a symbol of absolute dominance, had bled before a human. And in that instant, she realized that the armor she had trusted for centuries had never truly been perfect. The weakness had always been there, waiting to be exposed. Elias did not celebrate. His body ached, his grip shook, and he could barely stand. But he had carved more than a wound into her armor. He had carved a truth into the battlefield. one that spread like fire across soldiers and survivors alike. The Dralith could be hurt. That single strike marked the turning point of the war. News of the impossible spread faster than plasma fire. Word rippled through both armies. The Queen's armor had been broken by a human blade. For years, the Dralith had cloaked themselves in a myth of invincibility. That myth cracked in an instant, and the battlefield shifted. The alien queen, furious and wounded, let out a roar that seemed to shake the rubble itself. She summoned her bodyguards, towering enforcers in jagged black armor whose weapons dripped with molten energy. They moved to surround Elias Kane, ready to erase the insult to their commander. But before they could close in, a squad of human survivors pulled him into the ruins. They were soldiers, engineers, medics, anyone who hadn't already been ground underfoot. They carried weapons pieced together from scavenged wrecks, rifles with mismatched power cells, explosives wired by hand, even sharpened steel where ammunition had run dry. These were not the elite, not the chosen. They were what humanity had left. Yet when they looked at Elias, there was fire in their eyes. They had seen what he had done. Among them was Lieutenant Mira Salas, pilot of a battered dropship that had barely escaped destruction. She was sharp-eyed, steady-handed, and stubborn enough to fly a craft that should have been junked weeks ago. She pressed a med patch against Elias's bleeding shoulder, her tone urgent. "Do you realize what you just did? You made her bleed. That will echo through every channel they use." Elias, pale and shaking, brushed off the attention. "I don't care about her pride. I care about pushing them back." His words were grim, but Mira understood the unspoken truth. He had cracked open something larger than pride. Above the burning colony, the 7th Terran Armada regrouped in orbit. Months of defeat had left them scattered and bloodied, but now, driven by the first sign that their enemy was not untouchable, they gathered their remaining strength. From the void, carriers launched wave after wave of fighters. Destroyers pushed forward, their torpedo tubes glowing as they emptied payloads. Even crippled ships fired what they had left. The Dralith did not retreat. They retaliated with cold, surgical precision. Their dreadnoughts cut through human formations, beams of blue fire slicing across kilometers of space, tearing ships in half with terrifying ease. On the surface, alien ground troops surged through the wreckage, marching in relentless formation. Yet a change was in the air, hesitation. For the first time, the Dralith soldiers glanced toward their queen. They had always fought under the certainty that she could not be harmed. Now they knew otherwise. Human resistance flared across the planet. Civilians armed with stolen sidearms ambushed patrols. Hidden bunkers became staging grounds for sabotage. Even those who had been running turned back. Emboldened by the rumor that a commander had pierced the Queen's defenses, Elias, still limping but unwilling to fall behind, joined Mira and the survivors as they launched hit-and-run raids across the city ruins. They targeted supply crawlers hauling energy cells for Dralith weapons. They cut off relay towers used to coordinate the invasion. Each strike was small compared to the size of the war, but each carried weight. The message spread across human comms like wildfire. They bleed. They can be broken. The Queen's fury only grew. She descended again, her crimson armor sealed but not unscarred, and directed the fight herself. Her presence was a storm of violence, her commands driving her troops with renewed ferocity. Yet there was a shadow over her certainty. Every glance toward her chest plate reminded her of the moment she had stumbled. Elias faced her across the battlefield once more, though not in direct combat yet. Her voice cut through the smoke and static. That strike was nothing but chance human. "You cannot repeat it." But her need to speak, to deny, betrayed what gnawed at her. The doubt. The fighting spread to the skies. In orbit, the Armada fought like cornered beasts. Human ships sacrificed themselves in brutal maneuvers, drawing dreadnoughts into asteroid belts where mined rocks detonated in chain reactions. Crews overloaded reactors, turning dying vessels into fireballs that consumed their pursuers. Tactics born of desperation, not tradition, allowed them to stand longer than the enemy expected. On the ground, Mira's dropship became a lifeline, darting through collapsing streets to pick up survivors, drop supplies, and ferry Elias to the next ambush. Its hull bore scorch marks and holes patched with scavenged plating, but it flew anyway. Every time Mira touched the controls, she did so with the same thought. If one man could make the Queen bleed, then one ship could hold the line long enough to matter. Still, the cost was unbearable. Entire units were wiped out. Families huddled in shelters only to be consumed by bombardments. Every victory came laced with grief. Yet grief was no longer the only fuel humans carried. There was now anger, purpose, and, most dangerously for the Draelith, hope. The Queen understood the danger of that word. That was why she issued her challenge, her voice carrying across human comm frequencies. "Come to me, Elias Kane. Prove your strength. Show me that your strike was more than luck." And with those words, she set the stage for a duel that would decide not just honor, but the fate of the war itself. The war in orbit turned space into a graveyard. Hundreds of ships burned, their wreckage scattering across the void like glowing embers. Terran frigates and carriers, already battered from years of retreat, hurled themselves against the Draelith juggernauts. For every enemy vessel destroyed, 3 human ships were lost. But numbers were no longer the whole story. Humanity fought with cunning, and that cunning bled the giants. From the bridge of Mira's dropship, Elias watched through cracked screens as fighters dove between hulking dreadnoughts, baiting enemy beams into colliding with their own escorts. Entire moons became weapons. Engineers detonated buried charges to fracture them, scattering debris fields that tore through pursuing fleets. When fuel ran out, pilots rammed their crafts directly into the enemy. Each act carved small wounds into the Draelith machine, death by 1,000 defiant cuts. On the ground, Elias refused to stay idle. His body barely healed, yet he moved like a man possessed. With Mira's ship as their shuttle, he led teams deep into enemy-held zones. They struck at power nodes that fed the aliens' energy shields. They raided convoys, stealing ammunition and food that kept the invaders moving. Each mission cost lives, yet every loss dragged the Queen's forces further from the image of perfection they had once projected. But Elias knew the Queen was hunting him. He could feel her shadow every time he raised the stolen blade. She no longer looked at humanity as an inconvenience. She looked at him as a challenge that had to be erased. Reports came of her descending in person to battles she would normally delegate. She fought with a savagery that made entire units crumble, her crimson armor a beacon of wrath. Yet always her troops looked uneasily at the faint scar carved across her chest plate. The 7th Armada fought above, but communications were filled with screams. Captains reported catastrophic losses, whole wings wiped out. Yet there was a new tone threaded through their transmissions. They spoke not as prey, but as equals daring to defy. One pilot's last words, before detonating his failing engine in the belly of a dreadnought, echoed across comms. "For Kane! For the strike!" The Queen's obsession soon became undeniable. On the ruins of the capital city, her image appeared on open channels, her voice reverberating across every human frequency. "Elias Kane," she declared, "you wounded me once. I will erase you before your species mistakes fortune for strength. Face me and prove your defiance was not a fluke." Mira listened, hands tightening on the dropship's controls. "She's rattled," she whispered. But rattled or not, the Queen was dangerous beyond measure. Elias knew he couldn't refuse. If he ignored her, the morale that had surged since his first strike would fade. If he accepted, he risked not only his life, but the thin thread of hope binding humanity together. He answered anyway, his voice steady over the comm. "You'll have your fight. But when I win again, it won't just be your armor that shatters." The duel was set. In the days that followed, human strategy revolved around buying Elias the chance to meet her. Entire fleets repositioned, throwing themselves into suicide engagements to drag Draelith strength away from the capital. On the surface, resistance groups coordinated sabotage to slow troop movements. It was not just about surviving anymore. Every action was designed to carve a path for their chosen blade-bearer to reach the Queen. Still, the cost mounted. Mira's dropship was riddled with holes after one desperate dive through a storm of anti-air fire. Half the survivors Elias had rallied were lost in a skirmish that left entire blocks flattened. Even victories tasted of ash, yet each setback only seemed to harden the determination in Elias's eyes. He carried the weight of the dead on his shoulders, their memory pushing him toward the inevitable confrontation. The queen herself grew more reckless, abandoning calculated tactics for direct assaults. She wanted him, wanted to crush the defiance that had unmade her legend. To the Dralith, this duel was not personal, it was existential. If their queen could be broken twice, the Empire's entire aura of dominance might unravel. Finally, amid the smoke of burning towers, Elias stood at the threshold of the Capitol spire, blade in hand. Above him, the sky was ablaze with the dying Armada's last stand. Around him, Mira and a handful of survivors cleared the way with gunfire and grit. And ahead, waiting in a storm of heat and shadow, the Queen's towering form emerged, her armor bristling with alien spikes, her weapon blazing with raw energy. No more words across comms, no more whispers of rumor. The duel was real, and the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The spire that once crowned Vera IX's capital now stood like a broken tooth against the fiery sky. Its surface glowed with molten streaks where orbital bombardments had scorched it, and whole sections leaned dangerously, groaning as if the world itself was about to collapse. It was here, amid fire and ruin, that Elias Kane faced the Queen again. The ground vibrated before she even appeared. Then came the glow. Crimson armor alive with pulsing veins of energy, every plate reforged after the first wound but still marked with the scar he had cut. Her warblade thrummed, a jagged arc of alien alloy that spat sparks with every movement. To human eyes, she was a towering figure of inevitability. To her own people, she was the embodiment of conquest. Yet behind the shimmering plates was something Elias had seen, fear hidden under rage. He stood alone, his scavenged plasma sword chipped, its core unstable. His armor hung in pieces, chest exposed in places, helmet cracked. His hands trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. Days of non-stop fighting had drained him. Yet when his eyes locked on hers, there was no hesitation. The ruin around them faded. There was only the duel. The Queen moved first. Her strike tore through the air like lightning, smashing into the stone where he had stood a heartbeat earlier. Shards exploded outward, dust filling the air. Elias rolled, barely lifting his blade in time to parry the second blow. Sparks burst across his visor. The impact rattled his bones, nearly tearing the weapon from his grasp. She pressed forward with relentless fury. Each swing of her blade carried the weight to cleave armored vehicles in half. Every missed strike left craters in the stone. She was power incarnate. But Elias had no intention of matching her strength. He ducked under arcs, sidestepped at the last second, let her momentum crash into the ruins instead of him. He fought with instinct, sharpened by desperation. Their blades clashed again, the sound shrieking louder than the collapsing city around them. His weapon glowed white at the edge. Hers crackled with alien power. Every contact was a storm. Dust clouds rose, firestorms swirled, and still they moved, two figures locked in a rhythm that drew all eyes. The Queen snarled between strikes, her voice metallic and cold. "You are nothing but flesh and chance. You stand only because I allow it." Her blade descended, nearly splitting him in two, but he deflected at the last instant, sparks cutting across his arm. Blood spilled, but Elias answered through clenched teeth, "I stand because you can bleed. It was not a fight of equals." She was stronger, faster, armored. He was slower, battered, and fragile. But where she wielded brute force, he carried defiance. Every second he survived, every time his blade met hers instead of his flesh, chipped away at her composure. He could see it in the twitch of her movements, the rise in her tone, the impatience creeping into her perfect form. She lunged with a crushing overhead strike, determined to end it. Elias sidestepped, letting her blade smash into the stone. The ground trembled, the spire groaned, and in that moment of imbalance he struck. His sword bit into her side, piercing past her glowing plates. Alien blood sprayed, sizzling against molten rubble. The Queen staggered, shock flickering across her eyes. It wasn't a fatal wound, but it cut through the illusion of invulnerability she clung to. She looked down at the crack in her armor as if it were impossible. And Elias saw it, the crack not just in steel but in her mind. "You built your empire on fear," he said, chest heaving. "But fear breaks easier than armor." Her roar shook the ruins. She lashed out with renewed rage, hammering him back with a storm of blows. Each impact drove him closer to collapse. His blade chipped further, his armor shattered, his lungs screamed. Yet he refused to yield. His every movement screamed one truth: she was not untouchable. The duel raged across the spire's skeletal remains. Towers fell around them, fire rained from above, ash filled the air. But still the two figures clashed, human defiance against alien supremacy. Every soldier watching, Drelith or human, felt the ground shift beneath history itself. For in that moment both armies saw it clearly. The Queen was not immortal, and humanity was not broken. The duel atop the spire left both combatants staggering, but the Queen would not accept the humiliation of retreat. Wounded, furious, she raised her arm toward the heavens and commanded her fleets. In response, the Drelith ships began their purge. Their beams scythed downward, igniting the atmosphere into burning rivers of plasma. Whole districts vanished in curtains of fire. The capital, once humanity's jewel, became an inferno. High above, the Seventh Armada, what remained of humanity's strength, surged into one last assault. Carriers, already torn open and bleeding air, emptied their remaining squadrons. Frigates used their engines as battering rams. Every surviving captain issued the same order: no retreat. The void became a storm of collisions, detonations, and desperate maneuvers. Against impossible odds, humanity hurled itself forward, not as prey, but as executioners willing to die, dragging their enemy with them. Below, Elias Kane fell to his knees. His breath came in ragged gasps, his blade cracked down the middle. Blood seeped from wounds across his arms and legs, and he knew his body would not last. The Queen advanced, triumphant despite her injuries, her blade raised for the killing strike. Before it fell, Mira appeared, armor scorched, rifle glowing from overuse. She sprinted across collapsing stone, firing shot after shot into the Queen's flanks. The plasma rounds splashed uselessly against her armor, yet Mira did not stop. She shouted his name, reaching him just as another strike shook the ground. She dropped to her knees beside him, desperation written across her dirt-streaked face. "Get up, Kane! Don't you dare die here!" "Not after everything." She tried to pull him back, but he shoved her away, barely enough strength left to move his arm. "No, this ends with me." His voice was little more than a growl. His eyes locked on the Queen, who was closing in, towering over them both. In his hand, the broken plasma blade flickered weakly. Its core, unstable and overcharged from the battle, pulsed like a dying heart. Elias looked at it, then at the Queen, and a grim realization took hold. This weapon could not last another strike, but its core could still destroy. He ripped the core from the blade, its glow searing his hands, the energy biting into his skin. With the last strength left in his battered body, he hurled it forward. The core spun through the smoky air, embedding itself into the gap in the Queen's chest plate where his earlier strike had torn her open. For one frozen instant, time seemed to stop. The Queen's eyes widened as alien energy surged inside her. Then came the detonation. A blinding flash erupted, engulfing the spire in white fire. The explosion tore the Queen from her feet, shredding her crimson armor in a storm of molten shards. Her body convulsed, her voice rising in a scream not of rage but of disbelief. The invincible had been broken completely. Her armor shattered into fragments, her power unraveling as her form collapsed amid the ruin. The shockwave blasted outward, throwing soldiers, human and Drelith alike, across the battlefield. Structures toppled, firestorms scattered, comms went silent. When the smoke cleared, the Queen's body lay twisted and lifeless. The impossible had happened. The ruler of countless conquests was gone. Across the field, Drelith soldiers froze. Their advance halted as if struck by paralysis. For centuries, they had followed without question, their will chained to the certainty of her command. Now that certainty was gone. For the first time, the conquerors recoiled. Above, the fleets wavered. Without her guidance, their maneuvers faltered. Human captains seized the moment, ramming their ships into dreadnoughts, detonating warheads at point-blank range. Flames spread across the void as alien formations fractured. On the ground, Mira dragged herself back to Elias's side. He was half-conscious, chest heaving, body broken by the effort. She pressed against his wounds, tears cutting through soot on her face. "You did it," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "You actually did it." All around them, silence settled. The spire lay in ruins, the queen destroyed, her army stunned. The myth of invincibility had died with the shattering of her armor. Humanity, bloodied and fractured, had endured long enough to strike back. And in that one final act of defiance, Elias Kane had ended the terror that had hung over every world. The queen was gone. The war would never be the same. The battlefield after the queen's fall was unrecognizable. The spire that had towered for centuries was now rubble, its jagged skeleton jutting into an orange sky filled with smoke. Fires raged in every direction, consuming both human structures and alien fortresses alike. The silence that followed the explosion was heavier than the roar of battle, an unnatural stillness broken only by the groans of collapsing stone and the hiss of burning metal. At first, neither side moved. The Dralith legions, always a tide of unstoppable order, now stood frozen. Their queen, their living symbol of domination, was gone. They had never planned for this moment, never imagined defeat. Soldiers who had once marched without hesitation faltered, their weapons lowering slightly as uncertainty seeped into them like poison. On the human side, the survivors could barely believe what they were seeing. Men and women who had been fighting simply to buy time now lifted their heads and saw the impossible truth. Their greatest enemy lay broken. Whispers moved through the ranks, soft at first, then louder. "She's dead. The queen is dead." For the first time in years, those words carried not despair, but triumph. Mira knelt beside Elias Kane, who lay bleeding amid the rubble. His body was broken almost beyond saving, armor hanging in tatters, skin scorched from the energy blast. Yet his chest still rose and fell in shallow breaths. She cradled him, voice trembling as she tried to keep him awake. "Stay with me, Kane. You can't leave now. They need you." He managed a faint smile through cracked lips, eyes flickering open. "Not me. Us." His words were almost lost in the roar of distant explosions. But Mira heard them, and they anchored her. Above, the void reflected the shift. The Dralith fleet without its commander began to fracture. Ships that had once moved in flawless formation now stumbled in chaos. Some fired blindly, others turned and fled. The 7th Terran Armada, though half destroyed, surged with renewed fury. Captains barked orders filled with fire. "Press the attack. Drive them back." Human ships dove into the gaps, striking with precision born of desperation and rage. Dreadnoughts that had once seemed immortal burned in silence, their hulls splitting open as fighters swarmed them. Where once humans had only fought to survive, now they hunted. On the ground, the same transformation rippled. Resistance cells launched counterattacks, pushing into zones the Dralith had occupied for weeks. Civilian militias rose from bunkers, emboldened by the sight of their conquerors hesitating. For the first time, humans pushed forward not as victims, but as warriors. The Dralith, creatures who had known nothing but victory for centuries, began to fall back. Step by step, they retreated from the city, their lines disordered. Without the Queen's command, their unity cracked. And in that crack, humanity poured everything they had. Mira dragged Elias onto a makeshift stretcher as more survivors gathered. They looked at him not just as a man, but as a symbol. He had been the one to show them the truth. No armor was eternal, no empire unbreakable. Some saluted him, others whispered his name like a prayer. Even as he faded, Elias became the spark that carried them forward. When the final alien dropships lifted away from the surface, chased by human gunfire, the city was nothing but ruin. Yet amid the ashes, survivors raised their weapons to the sky and shouted with one voice. It wasn't victory in the traditional sense. Too many had died, too much had been lost. But it was more powerful than any triumph humanity had ever known. It was proof. Later, as medics worked to stabilize him, Elias whispered to Mira again, his voice weak but certain. "Tell them we were never helpless. Not against them. Not against anyone." His hand slipped into hers, rough and shaking, but filled with conviction. Across the galaxy, the ripples spread. Other human colonies, long silenced under occupation, heard the story. Broadcasts carried the news. The Queen is dead. Humanity struck her down. On planets where resistance had been nothing but a dream, people rose, emboldened. The Dralith's grip began to loosen, not through force of arms alone, but through the collapse of their legend. For generations, the Dralith had ruled by fear. Now fear turned against them, and in its place a new fire grew. Humanity's flame, born from defiance, fueled by sacrifice, now burned brighter than ever. The war was far from over, but its course had changed forever. No one would ever forget the moment one man shattered the Queen's armor and proved the truth that echoed across the stars.